talk about Parliament and the fact that Parliament's back this week. I want to ask you all, what's your expectations of the early parts of this Parliament here? What are you looking most for? Are you looking about how Morrison carries himself as a reinstated, reinvigorated Prime Minister? Are you looking for Albo and how he's able to move things around? What's your sense about, or is all of your action in the Senate? I'll start with you, Adam. What do you expect out of this place when it fires up tomorrow?
Well, I think the real test coming out of probably the next couple of sittings of Parliament is going to be how Anthony Albanese galvanises his troops. To date, we've seen him make a few leadership stumbles. I think the John Setka stuff has really caused internal problems for him inside the Labor Party and also with their partnership with the unions. Many thinking that he's got the wrong call on that from a tactical point of view, but also how he brings together his message and his decision on the tax cuts for the coalition. I think that most Australians are quite clear that there was a mandate at the election for not having a high taxing government in the alternate being Bill Shorten and Labor, but having a low taxing government. So I think Morrison's quite right to pass his tax cuts. But what we've seen by many Labor members, new and ones that have been there for a while, is a range of different messages, some saying pass it, some saying not. So I think there's a challenge for Albo's leadership in terms of how he brings everybody together to be on the same page, because it is just a mess at the moment. And I think you're quite right in saying that these are challenges for Albo, particularly when you've got Bill Shorten nipping at his heels, and he will do for the next 3 years.
Now, look, it's 9 o'clock on a Sunday night. I was hardly expecting the building to be buzzing. But we all know what the feeling was after the 2016 election, what the feeling was after the 2010 election. That immediate tension in the air that suggests something bad's going to happen on the government side of things because of the inevitability of scandal, all the rest of it. There is none of that feeling that you have going into this term. So, Darren Barnett, do you agree that the eyes go on to Labor about how they're handling it, or is that in and of itself a fundamental mistake? Because as Scomentum, the term I will get into that Macquarie Dictionary, works, that's winning when no one's paying attention.
Look, I think that Scott Morrison goes in and he'll be feeling very confident and very comfortable. He's had a good time at the G20. He's looked solid, he's looked strong. He's had an election victory that people didn't expect. Unlike a couple of those elections that you mentioned, 2010 obviously delivered a hung parliament, and while 2016 didn't deliver it straight up, by the end of the parliament, the government was effectively in a working minority. You mentioned before, I did some work for Karen Phelps. When Julia Banks crossed the floor, the government was in trouble, really, that they were at the beck and call of the crossbench. Now, all of that has now dissipated by the government being up to 77 seats. So I think attention shifts to the Senate, and we have to wait and see. I don't think Pauline was particularly thrilled with some things that happened during the election campaign. How does that play out? Centre Alliance, as you very rightly point out, both of the senators are due for re-election in 3 years, not 6. And Jack's back, and I imagine that she will play a more sort of middle-of-the-road role and probably pick her battles. So I think the Senate's going to be the absolutely fascinating thing to watch in the short term and in the medium term.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think, Campbell Newman? What's your expectation of those early days, what you're going to be looking at? Because, look, I'm not going to be looking for the media types around this building to say, hey, how did we get it wrong? Let's get into some introspection. I'd imagine that they'll be going harder than they ever have against the government, but who cares? They got it wrong so spectacularly. People have tuned out to the media games around this. What's your sense about how this building works for those first few weeks?
Well, look, I'm with both Darren and Adam, and just sort of almost recapping, but a little bit of extra. I mean, it's three things for me. It's the authority of the PM, and a lot of commentators are saying he goes in with that sort of authority, unprecedented authority. Absolutely. I think the Labor Party, Adam has pointed out quite rightfully, they have been all over the shop the last few weeks. But the overriding message that I get, and I think Chris Kenny had a great piece in The Australian yesterday, they just don't seem to be, actually recognising why they lost and what they have to do to turn it around. They really aren't doing that, so I'm going to watch that with some fascination. And the final thing is the way the Senate works, and I think the Coalition have some fence-mending to do with Pauline Hanson. I think some of the things that were said during the election campaign, and directly I'm talking about the PM, have not been forgotten and were not taken well at the time. Having said that, Malcolm Roberts, who's back in the Senate with One Nation, he's a very practical guy, very intelligent man, and he's someone I think the coalition can do business with. Jackie Lambie, that's going to be interesting. I expect it to be a far better Senate for the government if they manage the crossbench senators' expectations well and those relationships.
Yeah, well, it'll be fascinating to see. Certainly when it comes to the tax cuts at this moment, it looks like they're going to get up. Certainly Rex Patrick has said that at this stage, Centre Alliance looks like they'll get there, but wait, watch and see. So, as I said, the next couple of days, there'll be a lot of ceremonial stuff, a lot of Bob Hawke stuff, and then right into it. Fascinated to see. And as soon as that map gets told to us about where the seating map is, I'll tell you exactly where Bill Shorten's going to end up here. Darren, I want to ask you about that Bill Shorten factor because, interpersonally, right, while I don't want to be seen to be showing too much mercy, my stepfather said I have to show a little bit more mercy to the side that didn't win. OK, Wayne, I'll follow you through here. He's a good man.
We are early in the term, Paul. I'm not sure it'll last 3 years.
Correct. Obviously, look, part of the fun for someone like me was the sanctimony of someone like Shorten who expected that he'd be, after 6 years on this side of the desk, he'd be on that side of the desk. When he walks back in there, he walks back in and not only assumes a position he never intended in having, it's one that he begrudgingly takes. Because we all know what the tension is between him and Albanese. We also know the Labor leadership rules are pretty definite here, where it's pretty difficult to roll a leader and replace them. It's always easy to snipe and undermine a leader so they never get close to winning an election. What do you think about how Bill Shorten plays this? Because, sure, the first couple of days are interesting, but, geez, 3 years is a long slog after you've done 6 before.
True, but I doubt that Bill Shorten honestly expects that he will lead the Labor Party again, and I don't think that he would expect that he will be PM. This was his opportunity and it didn't come off. And obviously he was expected to win. He'd be incredibly disappointed. In some ways he didn't miss out by a great deal. It was a fairly status quo election in some ways. But look, he would be fooling himself if he thought now that there is a roadmap to becoming PM. It's not going to happen. And because of that, I think he'll probably behave himself. The bigger question would be, I don't think he's the kind of guy that will disappear early in the term, but I wouldn't have thought that he would serve more than one more term in the federal parliament, given what's just happened and what his future looks like.
Now, Adam Giles, I have to talk about the people in this building in their absence. They'll be here tomorrow, who cares? But these people got it very, very wrong, that being the political class here, and the Canberra bubble. The Prime Minister burst it lots of times in front of them, but they didn't notice. The Australian people burst it basically everywhere bar the Northern Territory. What's your sense, though, about what will end up obsessing this joint? Because my guess is when these people who were part of the woke revolution get it wrong, all they do is regroup and come back doubly as hard. They don't learn a lesson. What's your sense about how they'll play the next little while? And to be honest, I think the way they've been trying to talk about the ghost for the past week or so, rather than the Prime Minister having one-on-one, multiple-hour meetings with the President of the United States, kind of tells you they haven't learned an awful lot beyond the bubble.
Well, I'm not quite sure, but the one thing that's frustrating me at the moment is this commentary by the people in the bubble that you speak about, but also just the general conversations where Morrison won the unwinnable or the unexpected election, and the election that Shorten was supposed to win, as Darren was just talking about. That is completely wrong. This was an open democratic process. People had their vote, and the coalition won the election. They didn't sneak up and steal it, but the left and the Twitterati are out there saying this was the election that was taken away from us. And this is some of the sort of counselling that Labor members need to receive at the moment, because it was theirs and it was taken away in the dead of night. That's not the case at all. The country was thinking one thing, the intelligentsia was expecting another. Labor put out their policies. They were well supported by a minority, not enough to win government, and they should be congratulated for putting those policies out there. But the commentary needs to change to say that Morrison put out the best pitch, along with those in the coalition, particularly the Nationals, and they were successful. But coming back to your point about the people in the bubble and what they will say, they will keep pushing that line that Morrison's an illegitimate, or insinuating that Morrison's an illegitimate Prime Minister because it should have been Bill Shorten, but Morrison snuck it away. That's not the case. He had the best policies and Shorten had the worst policies. Morrison saved the country. That should be what the commentary should be about.
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, you know, Darren is no raving lefty here, so I'm not saying this about you, my body double, but Campbell, I mean, you've got to love this, right? Lefties, when they win, legitimate, forever wins, they are revolutions, they are permanent realignments. When Conservatives win, oh, that's because they cheated. Remember how Howard cheated in 2001 with the Tampa? You know, he kind of didn't deserve 2004. That's the logic here, where somehow, and you know, you've seen it the way that Guardian, when they're not writing conspiracy theories about us or begging for donations, are out there trying to desperate. Oh, first it was the memes, and then it was this lie and that lie, and Peter Dutton, and come on.
Well, Paul, I mean, really what we've seen since the election, or during the election campaign and since the election, is the disconnect with so many people in the Fourth Estate. I mean, let's park the politicians for a sec, the Labor Party. We've already sort of covered that. But the Fourth Estate, many of them are totally disconnected from the views of mainstream Australia. I know you don't want to talk about Folau, but just to use as an example, some of the interviews I watched on 7 and 9 during the week just passed and the ABC, the underlying assumption was what a terrible person, what terrible things he'd said, all that sort of stuff. And yet, you know, over 20,000 people then tipped money into the ACL fundraiser. So, you know, again, it's an example of the media think this, a lot of politicians, left-wing politicians think that, but there's a whole lot of people over here who I think that there's been a bit of a golden moment in the election. I think there's a whole lot of people who realise if they're sort of conservatives or, you know, Christian people or whatever, they realise now they've got to stand up and be counted in a way perhaps they haven't before. I think there's a bit of a sea change there in attitude.